Welcome to the latest in our Mishcon Disputes Flash webinars, what to do in the event of a fatality or a serious incident. I'm Kizzy Augustin, partner in White Collar Crime and Investigations and head of our health and safety practice at Mishcon de Reya. Before I introduce my two esteemed and expert guests, I want first of all to give you a practical example. Picture the scene. A groundworks subcontractor company involved in a new exciting construction project, converting a basement into a luxury cinema room and extra living space, somewhere prime in central London. High-end project with high expectations in terms of cost, but also quality. The company run by two brothers, one of which is extremely experienced in the construction industry and is a construction director, site manager for the project. In this case, a young worker, one of about 15 agency workers, was unfortunately crushed to death while working on a basement excavation. The excavations were said to be insufficiently supported and collapsed, crushing and trapping the worker. The emergency services were called, but he was pronounced dead at the scene. Now, the company itself went into liquidation during a 4-year criminal health and safety investigation. As a result, an individual director was prosecuted for manslaughter. And there was also a health and safety consultant who was advised on the project, who did things like draft risk assessments, method statements, and was said to have failed to take note of excavation risks or adapt to changes in the project. That consultant was also prosecuted for health and safety failings. Now, whilst there were other people who were responsible on the project, like the residential owner, main contractor, structural engineers, surveyors, site foremen, it was the director and the health and safety consultant that were held responsible. Both were prosecuted, full-blown investigation, and a trial ensued. Now, let me first turn to Crystal Danbury, with your expertise. You've been in the game 20 years as a health and safety expert, worked across a whole host of sectors. I've just given an example of a construction project that unfortunately went wrong and went through a prosecution. Where do you think businesses need to start in terms of dealing with something like this, a situation like this? Where should we start?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to address is that emergency preparedness piece. Actually, it's getting the right and competent people on board. You've already addressed things like consultants and directors of your business. So it's making sure that whoever you engage with has credibility and competence. But you really, really do have to be ready. The first thing that springs to my mind is that emergency preparedness piece. Accidents will happen. Major events like this do not have to happen. But when or if they do, you need to be really ready. And two things need to happen as a result. One of them is management of the event in the moment. First 24 to 48 hours, crucial. But also care is required. And typically the people that respond to these things will have one of two bents. You will be care driven or you will be compliance driven. And to have really good plans in place to make sure that you cover both of those bases. Regulators are informed, insurers informed, stakeholders are brought into play, but also you're taking care of those affected by the event, completely crucial.
And you've seen that across sectors. I mean, you've worked in nuclear, rail, logistics. Is it similar across sectors, or do you find that some sectors get it more than others?
It's the same. I think the thing that changes between sectors is how seriously they tend to take catastrophe planning. So I think rail, as an example, we are used to seeing the devastation that a rail crash happens because there's usually multiple or widespread fatality. The industries like that will really lean into emergency preparedness and take that seriously. Whereas really interesting scenarios like small construction sites in the basement, people tend to forget that that requires the exact same response. A negative event has happened, life or lives have been lost.
Yeah.
The same actions are required whole scale.
And what I want people on this call to get out of today really is to see some of the practical tips that the three of us can maybe share in terms of dealing with this type of incident. But one of the things I've certainly observed is how to deal with the regulator. Regulators are really wanting to see how you anticipate risk. This isn't about just response, but it is about how have you anticipated risk in relation to your sector. So for example, in the construction example I just used, the regulators, it was the police and the HSE, what they wanted to see was, what were your policies in place? How did you engage with staff? You had a huge amount of non-English speaking workers, of which the victim in this case was one of them. So it was how you managed risk. And unfortunately, it does start and stop with accountability by management.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with this at board level? How do you draft your communications? How do you engage with employees top down, but also how do you encourage information going bottom up? I think one of the tips maybe I could give at this point in terms of dealing with the emergency services, and those are the ones that come on the scene first off, is having a core investigation group. It's keeping information that goes out quite limited the way in which you have that external messaging going out, but being proactive and demonstrating a preventative measure externally. Alex, I mean, Alex, you're a partner in our construction group. Again, you deal with construction disputes. What have you seen from the construction world, the kind of practical things that can overlap a criminal investigation?
Yeah, well, I mean, you'll appreciate that health and safety is really, really important to the construction industry, and by the major contractors is taken incredibly seriously. Construction has significantly more fatalities annually than any other sector, and I mean, a lot of that is driven by the number of people working within the construction sector, but it's a huge area that contractors and owners focus on. And obviously, always, prevention is better than cure, and that's the that's the mantra. And having everything in place to minimize the risks is absolutely crucial, and that goes all the way through from the CDM regulations to requirements in the contract, to what's happening day to day on site. I mean, if an incident does happen, then obviously you've got your obligations to inform the HSC. If there's a fatality, you have to inform the police. On construction sites, you're really looking at securing the site, turning off machinery, ensuring that there's no further incidents, that you limit the impact as far as you can. And then in the first 24 to 48 hours, as well as dealing with the regulator, it's important to preserve evidence and keep records.
Yeah.
As much as you can as what's happened.
I mean, there's a lot to be done, and I think the biggest impact, both from a professional perspective and personal perspective, is that first 24 to 48 hours. So as you said, Alex, making that report to the HSE or another regulator, if it's another regulator involved. I think really important is to understand what your rights and entitlements are as an organisation, but also the individuals within it. So do you attend interviews? Should you attend interviews? If you don't, could you give a written response, for example? From a construction perspective in particular, it's that sharing of information between other people involved in the supply chain. I think that seems to be quite a sensitive issue, because sometimes you'll get some who want to share information, others don't. And it's how do you balance up that criminal obligation versus the contractual issues that follow. I mean, have you seen quite a lot of competing pressures, Alex, in respect of dealing with the contractual issues versus having to comply with some regulatory or criminal obligations?
I mean, honestly, not really. I think that the regulatory and the criminal investigation, that always has to come first, and the contractual repercussions then follow further down the line. You can't, you need to comply with those regulations first and foremost, and the criminal side of things. And then claims are, in this kind of disaster scenario, any claims really are secondary. And all you can do immediately is, like I said, keep your records and preserve the evidence. And then you can turn to that once the dust has settled.
And also you bring up a really, really good point about claims and so on. So having the right insurance in place to cover you not only for civil claims but also criminal investigations and prosecutions. There's a real distinction between the two. But also thinking about, do we need help with this civil claim? We can go to our insurers and get that help there. No doubt they'll provide you with lawyers, but also understanding that the criminal side of things is very different.
Yes.
And the criminal regulatory investigation is criminal. It can result in pretty dire consequences for companies, big fines, or even worst case scenario, and I promise not to say it too often, but prison for individuals. So really you do need specialist criminal regulatory lawyers who can help you with that. We touched on the investigation. Sorry, Crystal.
Actually, I was literally just about to go there with a couple of things that both you and Alex have said, and what it's really bringing home to me is the importance of your internal investigation. So sometimes in these moments when you have regulators, police, enforcers crawling all over your scene, there could be a feeling of stepping right back, allowing that complete control, but actually having really great representation that can tell you your rights to go in, the preservation of that scene, your own evidence collection, internal investigation is absolutely essential. And actually having great representation that can tell you about how to wrap that in privilege. And some people can look at that in it feels a bit, why would that be the focus? There is absolutely there is a huge amount of benefit in being able to have what I would call your dirty discovery conversations, what really happened, right? Dirty discovery.
Yeah.
But you need to have it in a safe space, because a small amount of information can be very dangerous in the wrong hands. What you're building is context to your event, and you can't do that in open forum. Yeah. So internal investigation, absolutely vital to prevent reoccurrence, as Alex said, but actually completely essential for getting to the roots of what really happened, so that you can answer what may come from your regulator or the police. And you can also really feed into any future possible prosecutions and to say, this is what we discovered, this was the context, and this is what we have done since to prevent reoccurrence. So all of that really, really vital from a care perspective, but also in managing an event.
I'll tell you what, I'm using that phrase, dirty discovery. I've never said it in that way. I say it, but not in that way. And it's really important. Well, it's a hook. It's a hook. And actually, I speak to a lot of clients about the benefit of using legal privilege. So, going to get advice from your lawyers, them instructing the business to go away and do an investigation. In anticipation of some form of legal proceedings, for example. But the dominant purpose of creating an investigation or an investigation report is for your lawyers. Give them the information so they can advise you. And the benefit of that is you can secure, confidentiality and privilege over your reports, your emails, and so on. But it means that you do not have to disclose this to third parties, including the police, including the regulators, including claimants, for example. So it's really important to get that right first off. But some people do, as you say, see it as maybe, are we hiding information? No, it's just slowing down the disclosure process and making sure you can battle it internally first, warts and all, before you decide how you share that information. In this scenario, we had a consultant, and I think using privilege was really helpful because it helped us understand what was going on under the surface and help us advise the director who was up for manslaughter. But we also had this health and safety consultant who unfortunately was also prosecuted for health and safety breaches in this case. What are we thinking about the shift towards individual accountability, particularly for consultants who are finding themselves now at the forefront of investigation as opposed to on the periphery helping an organisation? Crystal.
In terms of individual accountability, I think it's absolutely right. And I think this year is my 21st year working in safety. And the amount of people particularly in my early parts of my career, when this wasn't the case, when the individual accountability wasn't really there, that were just like, I'm probably just going to give it a go, going to give consulting a go, touching industries that they've never touched before. Actually, I think what this does is that stops the fairly flippant nature that used to exist. I'm definitely not saying it exists now, but used to exist in terms of, do you have what I would call the SCATE acronym for competence, skills, knowledge, aptitude, training, and experience? Do I have all of those for the sector that I'm touching? And I think it's right to push the accountability to the individual to say, if somebody's reaching out to you, you are the competent party. You're the one that says, I'm not skilled to step into this area. So I completely support it.
And it's this idea of what I'm getting theme-wise is you've got internal investigations, external investigations, normally running at the same time. You probably could also have, as well as a construction dispute between maybe client and contractor, you might also have an employment investigation going on as well, because there may have been some sort of negligence or misconduct undertaken. So there's a disciplinary issue. So you've got all of that happening. You know, how and also if there's been a fatality, you might well have an inquest in the offing as well, running alongside the prosecution. So there's so many things that could be happening at the one time, and I think it is really, really important to take stock. I think you'd mentioned it, Crystal. Take stock and deal with things on a much more manageable basis, and that probably does start and stop with management taking accountability. I think where we are at the moment in the UK is we have regulators wanting to see management lead. We've got specific guidance that talks about leading health and safety from the top. They want to see that these things are discussed at board level in minutes of meetings and so on, and you know that there is some accountability at all levels. I think where we are seeing a slight difference, and I bring it back to the construction example, and this might actually be for Alex, we're seeing a real shift in terms of not only personal accountability and responsibility, but also this idea about culture of organizations and behavioral, the behavioral approach to managing safety. I'm thinking of things like Building Safety Act, but also we've had it as part of our guidance. Building Safety Act talks about culture and competence, that being a factor when it comes to actively, proactively managing safety. Have you come across much more conversation now about culture and behavior when it comes to the construction sector, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not a recent thing. I've seen it, probably over the last 15 years with where health and safety 15 years ago really came to the fore, and you would see slogans on well-known construction companies. They have particular slogans on their hard hats and particular slogans on on their high-vis jackets about being safe, about getting home safe, and about and it really being boiled down into a number of golden rules, or for each company, they'll be different, but along the same themes of, we take care of each other, and, nothing is so important that it can't be done safely. And this idea of not, of it not being an inevitability that there will be fatalities, it being a real mind shift. And that, and that's, progressed, I think, in the last 15 years. And now, there's more, focus towards well-being is being kind of encompassed within the health and safety. And that's moved on. But I think what we've seen in the fatalities is a plateau, and it's hard to tell actually where that's going, because there was COVID, and the impact of that is quite hard to measure. And it'll be interesting over the next couple of years whether we have now, after a huge decrease in workplace fatalities, whether now we've plateaued, and whether it does now need another kind of step on. There needs to be something else done. And and construction has the highest number of fatalities, but actually the industry with the highest incidence is agriculture. And incidents per number of workers is in that sector, and it'd be interesting to see whether that there can be another step change. Like
construction lead it. I think, to be fair, I think the construction world kind of lead in terms of initiatives, and the seriousness with which they take the management of safety. I think they do such a good job in terms of pushing that message. I think other sectors, like you say, agriculture, who don't necessarily get so much airtime, could learn a lot from the approach in particular. But you mentioned something about well-being and kind of that individual impact, personal impact. There is something around the way in which employees and others who might be affected by a serious incident or a fatality are dealt with. So it's managing the personal impact. How do we deliver messages to the rest of the staff? For example, in the construction example I just used, it's how the rest of the staff were treated immediately after the incident. Were their well-being looked after? Because they are also affected. family of the director and the consultant having to go through a very public investigation and prosecution. There's all those thinking. I mean, those are the things certainly that needs to be considered as part of your incident response protocol.
Yeah, definitely.
I think moving on from that, kind of those are the immediate things to think about. Impact on others within the organization, accountability, instructing the right experts, consultants, lawyers to help you with your internal and external investigation. Longer term, we might well be dealing with, as I said, inquests when there's a prosecution, dealing with the prosecution itself and how you deal with giving of evidence, for example. I mean, yes, I've been in court lots of times, but even I have been nervous at giving evidence as a witness. I've done it twice. So it's preparing you for that if you do have to get involved in a prosecution. It's dealing with sentencing, as I've said, huge fines. In a lot of cases, we're dealing with £1 million fines, where there hasn't even though we're dealing with a fatality and serious incident here, you might be dealing with a situation where there isn't a fatality and you've just exposed potentially someone to risk.
Yeah.
You can still go through a very active prosecution. You can still deal with all the consequences of that.
Yeah.
And dealing with the injured parties, dealing with claims and so on. The one thing I just want to touch on before I maybe sum up and give us the idea of where we're at in terms of that example is reputational risk. Because yes, we can cater for paying out a civil claim or even huge fines. How do we deal with reputational risk management, Crystal?
In the
$1 million question.
Something million dollar question. I think it goes right back to, I think you have to start as you mean to go on. So what you're doing in the first 24 and 48 hours in terms of those two things I mentioned, the management of the event and the care as a result of the event. You've already touched on the care piece in terms of witnesses, the injured parties, etc. But not only, I mean, from my perspective, I'm going to be biased, right? I've done this forever, will never do anything else because I love people and I think people have a right to be taken care of. So I'm naturally going to say there is moral benefits and we should be taking care of those people. But the reverse, if you turn that whole question on its head, what do you think that really looks like if you do not deal with the care element of this event? That's conversations in the pub, that's conversations across stakeholders, that's conversations in your peer groups, in your industry. You don't want to, I mean, I would hope nobody would be approaching this coldly, but let's just say they do. It's not somewhere that you want to be. And not just from a reputational and brand perspective, but actually it feeds into court. It feeds into where the judge lands or a jury lands, or even how
your mitigation,
or the litigation, or even the inquest and how that feels.
Yeah.
How you took care of the person on the day, because lots of that investigation is going to be how you took care of people leading up to that point, what led to that event.
Yeah.
But everything after, you must understand, also has a complete ability to enrich your reputation in terms of that you did this very morally, you did this well.
And intentionally
Absolutely,
as well.
Absolutely. And you accepted your ownership and your part to play. Or you did the opposite, and that plays out, as mentioned before, negatively.
Well, let me maybe tie some of those themes together and give people on this call an idea of how this concluded. So this prosecution took place. This was a case that I did. Prosecution took place. Both parties found guilty. It took a bit longer for the director, but on sentencing, the judge said that the consultant in particular, his defense was ludicrous. He really should have done more to secure the safety of the people he was advising, and showed a real disregard to health and safety. So after the trial, the health and safety consultant was actually found guilty of exposing others to health and safety risks and imprisoned immediately for 9 months. That was shockwaves through the consultancy world. But also the director, who was again sentenced 4 years to the day after the incident took place, found guilty of manslaughter and was sentenced to 3 years, 3 months in prison. No one ever wants to go through that. And in fact, this was probably one of the first cases I'd done that made me really rethink my decision to practice law, because I thought it was an absolute injustice. But the reality is this sort of stuff happens. Directors who never ever think they're going to be in this situation could find themselves being held responsible and accountable for something that goes wrong within the business.
Absolutely.
So director went to prison, came back out, is now back working in construction as a labourer. But for me, some of the real key messages were him understanding what his role was within the business, making sure that he engaged with staff a bit more than he did, the impact of this case on his family, his colleagues, and his ability to run his business, because that went bust, and also engaging with the regulator and how you did that. These were some of the lessons that we took from the example. So I think what hopefully we've got from what you've got from the three of us is be accountable, be intentional, think about not just top level management, but also how you manage your business, from your employees to your third-party suppliers to the rest of the supply chain, if I can put it in the most general terms, but also those who have been impacted by a serious incident or fatality. And prepare, right?
Yes.
It is about being preventative. It is about not waiting for these incidents to happen or waiting for the regulators to knock on the door, but get experts in, get practical experts in, get lawyers in, people who can help you be as prepared as you possibly can for a dire consequence from a serious incident that I've described.
Well said.
Okay. I think we may have time for one question. I'm kind of looking to see if we can answer one question. Am I getting nods from, I'm not getting anything, so I'm just going to take one question, I think, before we disappear. We did have a question about legal privilege. That could take all day. So I'm quite happy, I think, or maybe offline, to discuss with you what that might mean. I think it's Philip, what that might mean for your business. But essentially, it's securing lawyers to help you with your internal investigation, so it can be protected and not have to be automatically disclosable to third parties. But again, I can go through that in lots of detail. I think I just wanted to answer a question. How can managers balance, from Emily, how can managers balance having a preparedness plan which is sufficiently detailed and not being able to anticipate what the fatal event will involve? So how do we think about a preparedness plan, maybe a stock preparedness plan, and how do we try and anticipate what risks we need to include in our overall preparedness plan? Maybe from both of you.
I think my first thing is remember, preparedness is preparedness for a negative event, not a particular scenario. The minute you go down a particular scenario route, you will be there all day with the detail, and it will never, it's like a birthing plan. For anyone that's ever had a partner or has been pregnant, don't make the plan. It never works.
Never worked for me.
It never works. So but what you're actually saying is, when something negative happens, who needs to know?
Yeah.
Where do I need to go out and touch? Where do I need support from? It's identifying your resources and your people and your communication chains when something negative happens. And just remember, if you call somebody at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're calling a competent party, and all of that normal risk assessing and conversation about what should happen next. Part of that plan is, I'm talking to the right person, and we decide then. You don't have to know the answers before.
Agreed. And sorry, Alex, did you have something to add?
I mean, I was going to say, I think, the second part of the preparedness plan is thinking about not just the first 24 to 48 hours, but the longer term. How do we learn from this? We don't want to kind of paper over these cracks and find ourselves in this situation again in 6 months or a year. We need to have a plan about, when the dust has settled, learning.
Yeah. I think bedding in the internal investigation into that preparedness thing is, when do you kick off? What do you gather on the day? Essential.
All part of your long-term protocol, right?
Absolutely. I think great point, Alex.
Yeah. I just wanted to try and see if I can fit one more in. I know we're closing up for time. Just Leonard has asked a question. When you say director, do we mean owner? I'm just going to answer that very, very quickly. There are specific offences in health and safety for directors and senior managers, and the definition of what we mean by that could be quite wide. So I think it's anyone who has influence over activities, anyone senior enough to make those decisions and be accountable. So it doesn't have to be someone who's got the name director in their job title. Okay, thanks for sticking with us. If hopefully some of this has resonated with some of you on the call, but if you'd like to speak to any of us about the issues discussed, or perhaps any other health and safety related issues, there's going to be a link in the follow-up email to all of you, maybe to put in a 15-minute discussion with myself or Alex, or we can get some advice from Crystal. But leaves me to say thank you very much for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed, and see you soon at the next Flash webinar.